In the frigid dawn of January 15th, 1940, as ice crackled beneath military boots in northern China, Dr. Shiro Ishii surveyed his creation with clinical pride. The sprawling complex near Harbin, known officially as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, concealed horrors behind its mundane name. 24-year-old Wei Liu, captured 3 weeks earlier while tending his family's small farm, became the 3,000th prisoner to disappear inside the facility's walls. What followed, over the next 74 days, transformed his body into an unrecognizable testament to human cruelty, subjected to vivisection without anesthesia, infected with plague bacteria, and exposed to temperatures so extreme his limbs shattered when struck with a hammer. The most disturbing experiments conducted by Imperial Japan during the Second World War remained hidden for decades as American officials granted immunity in exchange for data. This is the story of how ordinary doctors became architects of calculated suffering, how prisoners became maruta, or logs, in the eyes of their tormentors, and what happens when science abandons its humanity. Subscribe now to discover what secret records finally revealed when they emerged from government archives 50 years later. The Manchurian winter of 1939 choked the landscape with snow 3 feet deep when construction of the facility known as Unit 731 reached completion. Located in the puppet state of Manchukuo near the city of Harbin, the sprawling compound sprawled across 6 square kilometers of cleared forest and frozen earth. Behind its heavily guarded perimeter walls stood more than 70 buildings, laboratories, barracks, crematoriums, prison blocks, and administrative offices, all arranged with the methodical precision of military planning. To the outside world, this installation served the noble purpose of disease prevention research for Japanese troops. The truth would remain buried for decades, concealed behind walls of secrecy, international politics, and calculated denial. Dr. Shiro Ishii, a military physician with ambitious vision and remarkable absence of ethical constraint, commanded this research complex with absolute authority. Standing 6 feet tall, usually large for a Japanese man of his generation, he possessed a booming voice that carried across laboratories and a dominating personality that demanded complete obedience. His credentials from Imperial University in Tokyo brought him respect, but his connections to the imperial family granted him unprecedented freedom to pursue research others would consider unthinkable. By age 40, Ishii had risen rapidly through military medical ranks by convincing superiors that biological warfare represented the future of modern conflict. Now he commanded a facility where no moral boundaries would limit scientific inquiry. History will remember us as pioneers. He frequently reminded the 300 doctors and research staff under his command during morning assemblies. The work we accomplish here will protect our emperor and ensure Japanese dominance across Asia for centuries. What Ishii never publicly acknowledged was how this pioneering research required a constant supply of human test subjects, Chinese civilians, captured resistance fighters, political prisoners, and ethnic Koreans, all classified not as people but as maruta, the Japanese word for logs, materials to be consumed in the furnace of imperial ambition. Wei Liu never intended to become part of this machinery of death. At 24 years old, his concerns centered around his family's small farm 30 miles outside Harbin, his upcoming marriage to neighbor Meizhong, and surviving another harsh winter under Japanese occupation. Standing 5 feet, 7 inches tall with calloused hands that testified to years of agricultural labor, Wei represented what the Japanese occupation forces considered an expendable element of the conquered population. His capture occurred during a routine sweep of rural areas for resistance activity. Being young, male, and Chinese proved sufficient criteria for detention. "You will be questioned and released if found innocent," the Japanese sergeant told him through an interpreter after soldiers dragged him from his home while his mother wailed in the doorway. The promised interrogation never occurred. Instead, Wei joined 60 other prisoners crammed into a covered truck that delivered them directly to the gates of Unit 731 on December 27, 1939. As the heavy steel gates swung closed behind the vehicle, any possibility of returning to his former life vanished like breath in the Manchurian cold. Processing occurred with assembly line efficiency. Guards separated prisoners by gender, approximate age, and apparent health condition. Those deemed most physically robust, including Wei, received injections of vitamins and preventative medications, not from compassion, but to ensure experimental subjects remained free from uncontrolled variables that might compromise research results. Guards shaved their heads, assigned each a numerical designation rather than a name, and photographed them for laboratory records. Wei became known only as Subject 2754. The residential blocks where prisoners lived bore more resemblance to animal pens than human housing. Concrete floors with inadequate straw bedding, minimal sanitary facilities, and meals consisting primarily of thin gruel with occasional vegetables maintained prisoners in a state of malnourished compliance. Armed guards patrolled constantly. Though escape attempts remained rare, The facility's isolation, combined with prisoners' weakened condition and the freezing temperatures beyond the walls, rendered freedom a nearly impossible proposition. Dr. Masaji Kitano, chief of the medical staff under Ishii, maintained meticulous records of each prisoner's physical condition. A slender man with wire-rimmed glasses and perpetually ink-stained fingers, Kitano approached human experimentation with the detached curiosity of an entomologist classifying insects. Subject 2754 presents optimal physiological parameters, he noted in his initial assessment of Wei. Recommended for priority research protocols in Division 2 Biological Vector Study. Division 2 specialized in the deliberate infection of human subjects with deadly pathogens, plague, anthrax, cholera, typhoid, to document disease progression and evaluate treatment protocols. Wei and 11 other prisoners were selected for what researchers clinically designated as Project 73. Transmission efficiency. Comparison between flea vectors and direct injection methods for Yersinia pestis. In ordinary terms, they would be deliberately infected with plague bacteria through different methods to determine which approach created the most effective biological weapon. The experimental chamber where Wei found himself on January 3, 1940, resembled an ordinary medical examination room with one critical difference: heavy steel restraints attached to the examination table. Dr. Chihiro Tamura, a researcher who had abandoned a promising career at a civilian hospital in Kyoto to join Unit 731, supervised the procedure. At 32 years old, Tamura had already participated in dozens of fatal human experiments, each justifying the next, in service to what he considered a higher scientific purpose. Beginning primary exposure protocol for Subject 2, 754, he dictated to a female nurse who recorded his words without visible emotion. Time is 0930 hours. Method is direct subcutaneous injection. Left forearm, standard concentration as per experimental parameters. Wei struggled against his restraints when the needle approached, earning him a sharp blow from the attending guard. Remain still if you wish this to proceed without additional discomfort, Tamura stated flatly in broken Chinese. The irony of offering this minimal consideration while injecting plague bacteria passed unremarked. Following infection, researchers transferred Wei to an isolation room where observation windows and recording equipment allowed documentation of disease progression. Over the next 4 days, his temperature climbed relentlessly as bacteria multiplied within his bloodstream. Painful swellings developed in his lymph nodes, classic buboes of the disease that had once decimated medieval Europe. Researchers measured and photographed these manifestations with scientific precision, administering only enough fluids to ensure the disease completed its full course rather than losing the subject prematurely to dehydration. On the 6th day, as Wei drifted between consciousness and fevered delirium, the door to his room opened to admit 3 figures in protective garments. Dr. Ishii himself had arrived with Kitano and another senior researcher to observe this particularly promising case. Note the extensive lymphatic involvement while cognitive function remains partially intact, Ishii commented, prodding one of the swollen nodes with a gloved finger. This represents an optimal virulence profile for field deployment. Wei attempted to speak, to beg for water, for mercy, for his mother, but produced only a hoarse whisper through cracked lips. Ishii leaned closer to examine his eyes, then straightened with professional satisfaction. Schedule him for vivisection at 1600 hours today. I want to observe tissue samples from major organs, while pathogen concentration remains at peak levels. Vivisection, surgical dissection performed on living subjects without anesthesia, represented the most horrific research methodology employed at Unit 731, yet also the most common. Japanese researchers believed that anesthesia might alter tissue samples or obscure symptoms, compromising scientific observations. The practice also reflected the fundamental dehumanization that permeated the facility. The subjects were no longer people with rights or sensations, but merely research materials. Wei remained conscious through the beginning of the procedure in the main surgical theater. 6 doctors in surgical masks gathered around the operating table, while Ishii directed their work from a slight distance. Begin with the abdominal cavity, he instructed. I want to observe hepatic tissue response particularly. The first incision drew a scream that quickly diminished to whimpering as shock began to overtake Wei's system. Researchers proceeded methodically, removing tissue samples from liver, spleen, and intestines while periodically checking vital signs to ensure the subject remained alive. Only when they began extracting pulmonary tissue did Wei's heart finally surrender, 77 minutes into the procedure. Time of termination, 17 hours, announced the timekeeper, proceeding with remaining sample collection. Wei Liu, once a farmer with dreams of marriage and family, had completed his transformation into research data. His remains would later be cremated in the facility's incinerators, the ashes indistinguishable from thousands of others who had preceded him. The atrocities committed at Unit 731 extended far beyond infectious disease research. Different divisions specialized in various aspects of human experimentation, each contributing to Japan's biological warfare program, an understanding of human physiological limits. Division 3 focused on environmental trauma research, subjecting prisoners to extreme temperatures, pressure changes, or oxygen deprivation. 26-year-old Kim Sung-ji, a Korean political prisoner, endured their freezing research protocols in February 1940. Researchers forced her to submerge her hands in water near freezing, then moved her outdoors where temperatures reached negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit. As her flesh froze solid, doctors meticulously documented the progression of tissue damage, periodically striking her fingers with metal implements to demonstrate how they shattered like glass. Similar experiments involved freezing entire limbs, then attempting various rewarming techniques. Some subjects were immersed in hot water. Others warmed gradually, while some received no treatment at all as controls. The military application is clear, reported Division 3 Chief Dr. Yoshimura Hisato in his research summary. Our soldiers must operate in extreme environments across the empire. Understanding frostbite progression and optimal treatment protocols will preserve fighting capacity in winter campaigns. What remained unwritten was how hundreds of prisoners lost limbs or died during these experiments. Kim survived only 10 days before succumbing to infection from her extensively necrotic tissue. Her remains, like thousands of others, disappeared into the facility's crematorium. Division 4 specialized in trauma research, gunshot wounds, burns, explosive injuries, and crushing damage. Here, researchers deliberately inflicted standardized wounds on prisoners to evaluate treatment approaches and document damage patterns. 29-year-old Chinese university student Zhang Wei, captured distributing anti-Japanese literature in Harbin, experienced this division's work firsthand in April 1941. Over 3 weeks, researchers subjected Zhang to a series of escalating traumas. They began by shooting him through the muscle of his right thigh with different caliber weapons, treating each wound with varying protocols while documenting healing rates and infection patterns. Before these wounds fully healed, they proceeded to crush his left foot with standardized weight drops, meticulously photographing bone fragmentation patterns. Finally, they exposed portions of his back to thermal burns of precisely controlled temperatures and durations. The subject demonstrates remarkable physiological resilience, noted Dr. Osaka Toshio in his research files. Recommend final utilization in explosive pressure wave study. This clinical language masked the reality that Zhang had endured weeks of deliberate torture disguised as research, only to be designated for a terminal experiment where researchers would evaluate his internal organ damage following proximity to a controlled explosion. Division 5 focused on chemical weapon development, testing various compounds on human subjects to evaluate lethality, symptoms, and potential treatments. Their test chambers allowed researchers to expose groups of prisoners to precisely controlled concentrations of chemical agents while observing the effects through reinforced glass windows. American prisoner of war, Corporal James Miller, captured in the Philippines in 1944 and transported to the facility, encountered this division's work during the final year of the war. As one of the few Western prisoners at the facility, Miller received special attention from researchers curious about potential racial differences in chemical weapon susceptibility. Over 6 separate sessions, researchers exposed him to mustard gas at increasing concentrations, documenting the progression of blistering across his skin, respiratory distress, and ocular damage. Between exposures, doctors treated specific areas with experimental countermeasures while leaving other affected regions untreated as controls. Miller survived longer than expected, prompting Division 5 Chief Dr. Kaneko Shohei to authorize more aggressive protocols. Subject demonstrates unexpected tolerance to standard concentrations, Kaneko noted. Increase to lethal confirmation level for next exposure series. Miller died during the subsequent test, his lungs irreparably damaged by chemical burns. Like other Allied prisoners who disappeared into Unit 731, official records would later list him as having died of pneumonia while being transported between POW camps. Among the most disturbing research programs conducted at the facility were the surgical training and anatomical studies. Prisoners designated for these purposes essentially became living cadavers for Japanese surgeons to practice techniques without concern for patient survival. Young doctors newly assigned to the unit demonstrated their commitment by performing complex procedures on living, unanesthetized subjects, removing organs, amputating limbs, or creating artificial conditions like pneumothorax or hemorrhage that the surgeons would then attempt to repair. 18-year-old Russian émigré Anna Petrovna, whose family had fled the Soviet Union only to be caught in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, endured this program in June 1942. Over a 4-day period, surgeons performed a series of increasingly invasive abdominal procedures, removing her appendix, then a kidney, and finally portions of her intestines, all while keeping her alive and conscious to observe pain responses and physiological adaptations to the progressive trauma. The facility's researchers justified such practices as necessary for training military surgeons who would need to perform under battlefield conditions. The reality, according to post-war testimony from Japanese medical staff who later expressed remorse, was that these exercises often devolved into competitions or demonstrations of surgical technique with no legitimate research value. The biological warfare field testing program extended beyond simple observation of disease, spread to include sophisticated epidemiological studies that tracked infection patterns through generations of transmission. These operations typically began with aerial delivery of disease vectors over selected Chinese communities, usually villages isolated enough to prevent disease spread beyond intended study parameters, yet large enough to provide statistically significant population samples. The village of Ningbo in Zhejiang province became one such test site in October 1941. Aircraft dropped ceramic bombs containing plague-infected fleas across residential areas during early morning hours when most villagers remained indoors. Japanese teams, disguised as public health workers, entered the village 2 weeks later, ostensibly offering medical assistance while actually documenting infection progression and transmission patterns. They established a field laboratory in the village school where they conducted blood tests and collected tissue samples from the dead and dying under the pretense of diagnostic necessity. Primary vector dispersal achieved infection rate of approximately 62% among exposed population, reported field team leader Dr. Ryoichi Naito in his classified assessment. The secondary transmission through human-to-human contact proceeded at calculated rate of 9 new cases daily during peak infection period. Mortality reached 78% in untreated subjects, with highest rates among elderly and infant demographic segments. The team remained in Ningbo for 43 days, documenting the complete infection cycle while providing limited treatment only to those subjects deemed most valuable for ongoing observation. By the operation's conclusion, 863 villagers had died, their suffering meticulously photographed, measured, and incorporated into Japanese biological warfare doctrine. Similar operations targeted at least 11 other communities across occupied China, with estimated civilian casualties exceeding 10,000. What distinguished these field operations from conventional warfare was their fundamental purpose, not simply to kill enemy populations, but to study them as they died, treating entire communities as laboratory specimens rather than human beings. This represented the logical extension of Unit 731's underlying philosophy applied beyond facility walls to encompass civilian populations. The detailed epidemiological data collected from these operations proved particularly valuable to American biological warfare experts after the war, informing their understanding of large-scale bioweapon deployment potential. The water deprivation experiments, conducted by Division 6, received less historical attention than other programs, but represented some of the facility's most inhumane research. These experiments methodically documented human physiological deterioration under controlled dehydration, information considered valuable for military operations in resource-limited environments. Prisoners received precisely measured water rations, while researchers monitored vital signs, cognitive function, organ failure progression, and survival duration. 37-year-old Chinese farmer Wu Jiangguo endured the longest documented water deprivation protocol, surviving 19 days on 80 milliliters of water daily, approximately one-third the minimum required for basic physiological function. Researchers collected daily blood and urine samples to track electrolyte imbalances and kidney function decline, conducted cognitive assessments every 6 hours, and photographed physical deterioration progression. Wu's body underwent dramatic changes during this period, losing 29% of his initial body weight, developing advanced uremic poisoning as kidneys failed, experiencing hallucinations from toxin accumulation in his brain, and ultimately dying from catastrophic multi-organ failure. Subject demonstrates remarkable adaptive mechanisms for conserving fluid, noted researcher Dr. Hideki Mori in his experimental summary. Cessation of tear production observed by day 4, saliva production minimal by day 7, urinary output reduced to 30 milliliters daily by day 12. Cognitive decline accelerated after day 14, suggesting brain tissue dehydration threshold approximately correlates with 24% total body water loss. Similar protocols examined differential survival rates when subjects received the same water quantities administered through different methods, oral consumption versus intravenous infusion, or with varying electrolyte modifications. Some prisoners received saline solutions precisely calibrated to accelerate dehydration while creating specific symptom profiles of interest. Others were subjected to comparative studies, where one kidney was surgically removed to evaluate how the remaining organ compensated under extreme conservation demands. By 1944, as Japan's military position in the Pacific War deteriorated, Unit 731 accelerated its research programs with increased urgency. Ishii recognized that the accumulated data might serve as valuable currency should Japan face defeat. He ordered comprehensive documentation of all research findings, creating multiple copies stored in separate locations. Simultaneously, preparations began for the facility's potential destruction to eliminate evidence of its activities. The Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan in August 1945 and subsequent invasion of Manchuria forced the final evacuation of Unit 731. As Red Army forces approached Harbin, Japanese staff destroyed much of the facility, burning records and bodies, demolishing buildings, and executing remaining prisoners to eliminate witnesses. Ishii and most senior researchers escaped to Japan before Soviet forces arrived, carrying microfilm copies of their most valuable research data. What followed after the war represents perhaps the most morally complex chapter in Unit 731's history. American occupation authorities, upon learning of the facility's research, faced a difficult decision. The data obtained through these atrocities potentially held significant scientific and military value, particularly in the developing Cold War context where biological warfare capabilities suddenly represented a critical intelligence concern. Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, assigned to investigate Japanese biological warfare activities for General Douglas MacArthur's occupation headquarters, initiated contact with Ishii in October 1945. What began as an investigation gradually transformed into negotiation. By 1947, American officials had secured a comprehensive deal: immunity from war crimes prosecution for Ishii and his researchers in exchange for their full research archives. Dr. Edwin Hill, who reviewed the Japanese data for the U.S. military, later commented with disturbing pragmatism, "The information procured from these experiments could not be obtained in our laboratories because of scruples attached to human experimentation. The data on human susceptibility to these diseases, while obtained through regrettable means, nevertheless represented valuable contributions to our defensive research program." The Soviet Union held its own war crimes trial in Khabarovsk in December 1949, where captured lower-level Unit 731 staff testified about the facility's activities. However, the major figures, protected by American immunity agreements, never faced justice. Ishii lived freely in Japan until his death from throat cancer in 1959, occasionally serving as a consultant to American biological warfare experts during the Korean War. For decades following World War II, both the Japanese government and American military authorities maintained strict secrecy regarding Unit 731. The immunity deal remained classified, while official histories either omitted the unit entirely or described it in sanitized terms as a conventional military medical research facility. Japanese school textbooks made no mention of biological experimentation or war crimes in Manchuria. Most of the doctors who had participated returned to respected positions in Japan's medical establishment, their past activities carefully concealed. This conspiracy of silence began to fracture only in the 1980s, when historians and journalists gained access to previously classified American documents through Freedom of Information Act requests. These revelations prompted the first comprehensive historical accounts of the unit's activities, though Japanese government acknowledgement remained limited, and no compensation was ever offered to Chinese victims or their families. The physical infrastructure of Unit 731 combined modern scientific capability with dedicated facilities for systematic cruelty. The main research complex encompassed over 70 buildings spread across 6 square kilometers, organized into specialized research zones separated by function. High perimeter walls topped with electrified wire surrounded the compound, while watchtowers, positioned at strategic intervals, allowed guards to observe all exterior grounds. The facility's remote location, 30 kilometers from Harbin in sparsely populated countryside, provided both isolation from civilian observation and natural containment for potential pathogen releases. Administrative headquarters occupied the facility's center, housing offices for Ishii and senior research directors, conference rooms where experimental results were presented in formal academic sessions, and communications equipment maintaining contact with military leadership in Tokyo. These buildings featured relatively comfortable amenities, including heating systems, proper furnishings, and dedicated mess facilities serving quality food, creating stark contrast with prisoner quarters located at the compound's periphery. 8 major laboratory buildings contained specialized equipment for different research divisions, each constructed according to scientific standards of the era. The primary pathology laboratory included 20 autopsy tables with overhead photography equipment, specialized ventilation systems to manage odors and airborne pathogens, and glass-fronted refrigerated storage rooms holding thousands of tissue samples. The microbiology wing featured cultivation chambers for growing bacteria in controlled environments, animal testing rooms where pathogens were evaluated before human trials, and production facilities capable of generating bacterial cultures in quantities sufficient for weapons deployment. The surgical wing represented the facility's most disturbing space, 8 operating theaters designed specifically for vivisection procedures. These rooms featured sloped floors with central drains to manage blood, specialized lighting arranged to eliminate shadows over operating fields, and observation galleries where researchers could watch procedures without directly participating. Unlike conventional hospitals, these theaters contained no anesthesia equipment beyond what was necessary for preliminary surgeries when subjects needed to remain healthy before terminal procedures. Leather restraint systems anchored to operating tables could secure struggling subjects of various sizes, while audio recording equipment documented physiological responses for later analysis. The prison compound consisted of 10 single-story buildings arranged in grid formation, each containing cells measuring approximately 6 feet by 8 feet, typically holding 3 to 5 prisoners despite the cramped dimensions. No insulation protected against Manchuria's extreme temperatures, with winter conditions, inside cells often reaching below freezing. Sanitation consisted of a single waste bucket per cell emptied once daily, while weekly delousing procedures involved high-pressure cold water hoses that simultaneously cleaned cells and punished prisoners. Purpose-built discipline cells, measuring 3 feet by 3 feet, were used for punitive isolation, too small for adult prisoners to sit or lie down, forcing them to remain standing sometimes for days until released. Between the laboratories and prison blocks stood the processing center where new arrivals underwent initial assessment. Here, medical staff conducted baseline examinations, created photographic records, assigned numeric designations replacing names, and categorized prisoners according to research suitability. This building's architecture reflected its transitional purpose. The entrance resembled a conventional medical clinic, while the exit led directly to prison blocks, symbolizing the transformation from person to research material that occurred within. Facility operations followed rigid protocols designed to maximize research productivity while maintaining security and psychological separation between staff and subjects. The day began at 5:30 each morning, with prisoner roll call conducted by guards who reported population counts to administrative headquarters. Meal distribution occurred at 6:30, consisting of rice, gruel, and occasionally vegetables, nutritionally adequate to maintain basic health but calibrated to ensure subjects remained weakened and compliant. Research divisions submitted subject requests daily, specifying number and physical characteristics needed for scheduled experiments. Selection details were recorded in the facility's master log, creating the documentation trail that would later provide evidence of systematic atrocities. Staff apartments located outside the main perimeter housed approximately 300 Japanese researchers and support personnel. These residential buildings provided comfortable living conditions, including family accommodations for senior staff members whose wives and children lived on site, creating the surreal circumstance where researchers could transition from conducting lethal human experiments to normal family dinners within the same hour. The facility maintained its own school for staff children, recreational facilities, including tennis courts, and a small theater showing Japanese films weekly, all elements of normalized existence juxtaposed against the industrialized cruelty occurring meters away. The psychological compartmentalization was absolute, recalled administrative clerk Takashi Kurakawa in a 1995 interview. Researchers discussed family matters, complained about ordinary inconveniences, celebrated birthdays, all while conducting experiments that would have horrified any normal medical professional. They seemed to occupy two separate realities simultaneously, with no apparent awareness of the contradiction. The facility's daily routine concealed extraordinary atrocities behind ordinary administrative procedures. Each morning began with research planning meetings where division chiefs outlined experimental priorities, allocated resources, and scheduled specialized equipment usage. These sessions resembled conventional academic discussions, with researchers presenting previous findings, debating methodological refinements, and establishing data collection standards. The normalized language of scientific discourse, control groups, experimental variables, statistical significance, created a veneer of legitimacy over fundamentally illegitimate activities. Morning rounds followed, with research teams visiting subject holding areas to evaluate potential candidates for scheduled procedures. This selection process frequently devolved into callous assessment of human beings as mere research resources, doctors discussing physical characteristics as dispassionately as laboratory technicians might discuss chemical reagents. This one has suitable vascular structures for the arterial pressure study, or this subject's respiratory capacity makes him optimal for the bronchial exposure protocol. Such clinical evaluations stripped prisoners of remaining humanity, reducing them to collections of biological systems available for manipulation. For prisoners, facility routines centered around surviving immediate conditions while enduring psychological torture of uncertainty. Each day brought the possibility of selection for experiments from which few returned. Those who did often came back mutilated, missing limbs, organs, or bearing surgical modifications that would haunt fellow prisoners who witnessed their suffering. This created an environment of perpetual psychological trauma where prisoners lived in constant anticipation of selection, while simultaneously witnessing the consequences for those already chosen. The waiting became its own form of torture, reported a rare survivor interviewed by Chinese investigators in 1946. Every footstep in the corridor, every opening door might mean selection for procedures everyone knew meant death. Sometimes prisoners would try to appear sicker or weaker to avoid selection for certain experiments, other times stronger to avoid being chosen for surgical practice. But there was no pattern to selections that prisoners could discern, leaving everyone in constant terror. Communication between prisoners occurred despite strict prohibition and surveillance. When new arrivals entered holding areas, experienced prisoners would whisper warnings about specific researchers known for particularly brutal procedures, or advise which physical symptoms might divert selection toward less immediately fatal experiments. Simple hand signals developed to convey information during brief moments when guards' attention wavered. These small acts of human connection represented extraordinary courage in an environment designed to eliminate all agency and dignity. The precise division of labor within research teams created emotional distance between individuals and the ultimate consequences of their work. Laboratory assistants might prepare equipment without directly witnessing its application. Record keepers documented results without participating in procedures that generated them. Support staff maintained facility operations without entering experimental areas. This fragmentation of responsibility allowed many personnel to mentally separate their specific tasks from the overall enterprise of systematic torture and murder, a psychological mechanism that facilitated participation among otherwise ordinary individuals. For the estimated 10,000 individuals who perished within Unit 731, historical recognition came too late. Wei Liu, Kim Sung-ji, Zhang Wei, James Miller, Anna Petrovna, their stories represent fragments of a larger tragedy where human beings were reduced to research materials, their suffering measured rather than prevented, their deaths documented rather than mourned. The most haunting aspect of Unit 731 remains not the physical brutality, but the intellectual corruption that enabled educated professionals to participate in such systematic atrocity. Doctors who had taken oaths to heal instead applied their knowledge to maximize suffering in pursuit of data. Scientists who might have advanced human knowledge instead perverted their skills to determine how efficiently humans could be destroyed. The facility demonstrates how easily professional ethics can collapse when moral boundaries are systematically eroded under nationalistic imperatives and dehumanizing ideologies. Historical records from the facility reveal that researchers frequently gathered for academic presentations where they discussed their findings with the dispassionate language and methodical approach of conventional medical conferences. They published papers in classified military medical journals, received promotions based on their contributions, and seemingly experienced little moral distress regarding their activities. This normalization of atrocity within a professional framework perhaps represents the most disturbing aspect of the entire operation. We worked in service to our nation and emperor, Dr. Kitano stated during a secret 1946 interview with American intelligence officers. The subjects would have died regardless as enemies of Japan. At least their deaths contributed to medical knowledge. This rationalization, that victims condemned to die anyway, might as well serve science through their suffering, echoes through many testimonies from those involved. What Unit 731 ultimately teaches us extends beyond the specific horrors of a single facility in wartime Manchuria. It demonstrates how easily ethical barriers collapse when three elements combine: dehumanization of the other, authority structures that diffuse personal responsibility, and ideological frameworks that elevate certain goals above human dignity. This dangerous convergence has manifested repeatedly throughout human history, though rarely with such systematic documentation as that preserved from this Japanese facility. The fact that most perpetrators escape justice, with some enjoying prestigious careers afterward, raises uncomfortable questions about how societies balance pragmatic interests against moral principles. The American decision to trade immunity for data established a precedent that valued information above accountability, a calculation whose full ethical implications continue to resonate through subsequent conflicts and intelligence operations. For modern China, Unit 731 represents both historical trauma and ongoing political leverage in relations with Japan. The Chinese government maintains museums documenting these atrocities and regularly incorporates this history into public discourse, particularly during periods of diplomatic tension with Japan. The site near Harbin draws thousands of Chinese visitors annually, its exhibits explicitly designed to evoke national remembrance of suffering under Japanese occupation. Japan's relationship with this history remains complex and often evasive. While some Japanese historians and activists have worked diligently to document and acknowledge these war crimes, official government positions have typically emphasized moving beyond historical grievances rather than directly confronting them. Japanese prime ministers have offered general apologies for wartime suffering, but avoided specific acknowledgement of biological warfare crimes. This hesitancy continues to complicate Japan's relations with China and Korea, where historical memory remains a powerful force in contemporary national identities. Perhaps the most important contemporary lesson from Unit 731 concerns how societies govern the relationship between scientific advancement and human values. Modern bioethics emerged largely as a response to 20th century research atrocities, establishing principles that place human dignity and informed consent at the center of legitimate inquiry. Yet as biotechnology advances create new capabilities for manipulating human biology, ethical frameworks face continuous challenges requiring vigilant reinforcement. The story of Unit 7. 3.1 does not end with its destruction in 1945, or even with the death of its perpetrators. It continues wherever societies navigate tensions between scientific possibility and moral constraint, wherever medical professionals consider the proper boundaries of their practice, wherever governments calculate the value of human rights against perceived national interests. In this sense, the facility remains not just historical evidence of past atrocity, but an enduring warning about potential futures if such boundaries fail again. For the thousands who disappeared behind its walls, people like Wei Liu, who had names, families, hopes, and futures before becoming anonymous research subjects, history's belated recognition cannot provide justice. Their suffering ended decades ago, transformed into data that ironically helped establish ethical standards designed to prevent similar atrocities. Perhaps the most meaningful memorial lies not in museums or historical accounts, but in the continued insistence that science must serve humanity rather than consume it. The facility's impact extended beyond its immediate victims to shape entire families and communities. Consider the experience of Chen Huilan, a 43-year-old shopkeeper from Harbin whose husband disappeared into Unit 731 in June 1942. For 3 years, she searched desperately for information, visiting Japanese administration offices weekly despite increasing personal risk. Your husband likely fled to join communist forces, officials repeatedly told her. Further inquiries may result in your own detention. After the war, Soviet investigators confirmed her husband had died in plague experiments, his body incinerated without ceremony. I cannot even properly mourn him, she told a Chinese historical commission in 1956. There is no grave, no remains, nothing to prove he existed except in my memory. Multiplied across thousands of families, this secondary trauma created wounds that spanned generations. Children who never knew parents, communities with missing members, and survivors who carried psychological scars deeper than any laboratory could measure. Some Unit 731 personnel eventually broke silence decades later, providing rare glimpses into the psychological mechanisms that enabled their participation. Nurse Toyo Ishikawa, who assisted in surgical experiments for 18 months before being transferred, spoke anonymously to a Japanese journalist in 1984. We told ourselves many things to continue functioning, that these people would die anyway, that our work would save Japanese lives, that following orders absolved us of responsibility. Each morning we performed our duties mechanically, focusing on procedures rather than people. Each night many of us drank heavily to sleep without dreams. Dr. Nobuo Kitagawa, who served in Division 4 until 1944 before returning to civilian practice in Tokyo after the war, provided one of the most candid accounts during a deathbed confession in 1972, recorded by his son, but not published until 1997. We created a separate reality within those walls, with its own logic and morality. Outside values ceased to exist. We stopped seeing humans and instead saw research protocols. The most terrifying realization of my life came not during my time there, but 30 years later, when I finally understood that we had not been monsters or psychopaths. We had been ordinary doctors who stepped across a boundary so gradually we did not notice until we were deep in the abyss. The facility's architectural design itself reflected its dual purpose of scientific research and systematic dehumanization. The main laboratory complex featured modern equipment arranged in efficient workflows, while simultaneously incorporating elements specifically designed to process humans as materials. Soundproofed surgical theaters prevented screams from disturbing nearby researchers. Drainage systems and floors accommodated blood and bodily fluids. Observation windows were positioned to give researchers optimal views while maintaining psychological distance from subjects. Even the prisoners' housing blocks were designed with experimentation priorities in mind, arranged to prevent disease cross-contamination between test groups while facilitating easy selection and transport of subjects. Professor Akira Matsui, a Japanese architectural historian who studied the facility's remains in the 1990s, noted, "The physical structure itself embodied the underlying ideology. Clinical efficiency merged with complete disregard for human dignity. Storage areas for living prisoners were designed with the same utilitarian approach as storage for laboratory supplies. The architecture created a physical environment where ethical boundaries became literally invisible." Beyond the better documented experiments, Unit 7.3. One conducted numerous specialized research programs that remained obscure until recent historical investigation. Division 7 focused on human endurance studies, determining how long subjects could survive under conditions of starvation, dehydration, or sleep deprivation while still performing basic tasks. 47-year-old Russian émigré Nikolai Petrov endured this division's 2-week starvation protocol in August 1943, during which researchers provided only 100 calories daily, while requiring him to perform standardized physical and cognitive tests until he eventually collapsed from organ failure. Division 8 specialized in gynecological and reproductive experiments, targeting female prisoners for some of the facility's most invasive procedures. 22-year-old Korean comfort station worker Park Min-ji, already victimized through sexual slavery by Japanese forces, was transferred to this division in October 1941 after becoming pregnant. Researchers used her to study fetal response to maternal infection, deliberately introducing typhoid bacteria during her second trimester. Both she and the unborn child died after 9 days of documented suffering that researchers photographed and measured at 6-hour intervals. Researchers maintained an extensive agricultural testing area where they developed methods for crop contamination and livestock infection, anticipating strategies to undermine enemy food supplies and prolonged conflicts. Fields of wheat, rice, and vegetables became testing grounds for various biological agents, while captured animals underwent parallel experiments to human subjects. These agricultural experiments eventually produced several biological weapons deployed against Chinese villages, including grain infected with anthrax spores that caused devastating outbreaks when distributed in Yunnan province in 1942. Perhaps most disturbing were experiments that served no apparent scientific or military purpose beyond satisfying individual researchers' curiosity or sadism. Numerous accounts describe procedures conducted without research protocols or documentation requirements, removing and reattaching limbs in different positions, creating artificial conjoined twins by surgically connecting two prisoners, or injecting air into cranial cavities to observe neurological effects. These unauthorized procedures typically occurred during overnight shifts when senior supervision decreased, representing the complete moral collapse that permeated the facility. The full scope of Unit 731's operations extended far beyond the main Harbin facility. At least 5 satellite installations operated across occupied China and Southeast Asia, each specializing in different research areas. Unit 5, 1-6, and Qiqihar focused on vaccine development through human experimentation. Unit 9-4, 3 in Changchun specialized in developing freeze-dried pathogens for weapon deployment. Unit 1-8-5. 5 in Beijing conducted psychological experiments and evaluated methods for breaking resistance among prisoners. This network employed over 3,000 research personnel at its peak and processed an estimated 12,000 victims between 1935 and 1945. Among the most tragic stories emerging from post-war investigations was that of the orphan detail, approximately 500 children, mostly Chinese orphans acquired from occupied territories, who became subjects in specialized pediatric experiments. Children offered unique research opportunities for studying developmental responses to trauma, disease susceptibility differences by age, and comparative healing rates. 9-year-old Li Shuying, captured after her entire family died during the Japanese bombardment of Nanjing, endured 6 months in the pediatric research ward before succumbing to surgical complications in April 1940. Nurse's aide Yuki Tanaka, who worked briefly in this section before requesting transfer, later testified. The children would ask when their parents were coming. We were instructed to tell them soon, always soon. Some researchers avoided the pediatric ward entirely, finding it more difficult to maintain emotional distance with children. Others seemed to prefer it, claiming children provided more consistent research subjects due to their undeveloped immune systems and limited prior exposure to pathogens. Post-war documentation reveals the extensive planning for even larger operations had Japan continued the war. Construction blueprints discovered in 1946 showed designs for an expanded facility capable of processing 5,000 subjects monthly, with specialized research wings for neurological experiments, improved biological weapon production facilities, and dedicated testing areas for evaluating pathogens on different racial groups. American intelligence assessments concluded that, had the Pacific War continued another year, Japan intended to dramatically expand its biological warfare capabilities for last-ditch deployment against Allied forces. The conflict between historical accountability and political expediency continued long after the immediate post-war immunity deals. In 1982, Japanese historian Keiichi Tsuneshi published the first comprehensive Japanese language history of Unit 731, drawing on declassified documents and interviews with former staff. His work faced significant opposition from government officials and conservative academics who preferred to minimize discussion of wartime atrocities. Several former unit personnel threatened legal action to prevent publication, though none ultimately followed through, likely fearing increased public attention. Chinese victims and their families first attempted to sue the Japanese government for compensation in 1993, filing cases in both Japanese and international courts. Despite presenting extensive documentation including facility records and survivor testimony, these cases consistently failed on technical grounds, exceeded statutes of limitations, sovereign immunity protections, or claims that post-war treaties had resolved all compensation issues. The last major case was dismissed by Japan's Supreme Court in 2007, effectively ending legal avenues for victim compensation. The legacy of Unit 731 continues to influence modern bioethics in ways both acknowledged and unexamined. When research ethics committees evaluate experimental protocols, they apply standards developed in direct response to wartime atrocities. Medical students worldwide study these historical cases as cautionary examples of professional ethics collapse. Yet uncomfortable questions persist about data derived from unethical research, whether using knowledge obtained through atrocity constitutes complicity, and whether rejection of such knowledge honors or further disrespects victims whose suffering produced it. From the ashes of places like Unit 731 emerged the fundamental principle that now guides legitimate research worldwide, that no knowledge is valuable enough to justify the deliberate infliction of suffering, that no national interest outweighs basic human dignity, that no person may be reduced to mere material for others' purposes. This ethical boundary, though sometimes strained, represents civilization's essential bulwark against the darkness that once flourished in a remote compound in Manchuria, where doctors became torturers and human beings became logs to be consumed in the furnace of imperial ambition.